A glance in the mirror. Chapter 10. Rural Home Life. In rural areas in the early 20th century, most children left school at 12 to start work. The Education Act of 1918 raised the age to 14. The school's inspector noted that arithmetic was not a strong subject, but that the discipline was good, and the children attended to their lessons. In the early afternoons, before the youngest children poured out of the main school doors, shouting and screaming, their mothers did the shopping and made courtesy calls, pushing their coach-built, second-hand, much-used prams containing the latest edition. It was a time relished by the mothers, knowing that their peaceful existence was about to be extinguished. They remembered the time in the same school, sometimes even the same teachers. The layout of the schoolrooms were recalled. The smells and the sounds were all the same. There were brothers, sisters, cousins, and even more distant relations, mingling with friends made many years before, all doing the same lessons in the same manner. After school, Elsie roamed the woods and fields with her sisters and brothers in search of birds' nests and fruits from the hedge to take home and present to their mother, which might stop her complaining about their torn clothes. She was strict, which was necessary, considering that at 37 she had 11 children to look after. Her life was a constant endeavour to make ends meet. Gentle, devoted and strong-willed, worshipping respectability and constancy. The children played hide-and-seek and red Indians, leaping the streams, climbing the trees, collecting bluebells in the wood, and constructing bows and arrows. Mum would be wearing her pinafore and hair in ribbons, her brothers corduroy knee breeches and a jersey. They would search the hedges for suitable sticks to make into pipes, whistles, catapults and pea-shooters, spud and pop guns, bows and arrows, lances, swords and daggers. The vibrating blade of grass held between thumbs made a whistling noise when air blown through. Owl hoots produced in the same way but without the grass, betting each other they could whistle louder or longer. Children still trundled their hoops, bowled marbles, tip-cat and skipped, drew hopscotch chalk lines, spun tops and constructed cat's cradle. Girls played their singing games, joined hands and skipped. Here we go gathering nuts in May. Jenny Jones visited, oranges and lemons chopped off heads, and what's the time Mr. Wolfe tempted great paces. The big ship sailed on the Alley-O, and the farmer wants a wife gave everyone a chance. Throwing a ball against the school walls, clapping hands while spinning round, sevens, or swapping marbles or cigarette cards, all games played at school. Conkers were swung in the autumn and daisies threaded in spring. All the children in the village went to Sunday school, whose numbers had been built up since the chapel had been built, erected thus enabling a choir of boys and young men to be formed. The morning service followed on after the school. The choir was used as a means of teaching basic music to the children, and would make them keener to continue attending. Occasionally there would be special services for a christening, Saint's Day, or Mothering Sunday. The annual Empire Day was celebrated using paper hats, previously painted in the Union Jack colours. Patriotic songs were sung, stories of daring do, of Cecil Rhodes and Captain Cook, atlases perused for its pink areas and places of British influence. It was a day for rejoicing and celebration, and greatly looked forward to. The organist, who doubled up as the choir master, religiously stuck to the few hymns, ancient and modern, which were well known and practised. It was a way of ensuring that there wouldn't be any embarrassing silences or mumbled verses. The church brought together all the various elements of the population, cementing the community together. Whether the day was wet or fine, the music of the choir gave the stark interior a softer touch. In the winter the cold seemed to be far more intense. Clothing wasn't so efficient at keeping the cold out, and often children had chapped hands and legs. Some cried when their hands started to thaw out while standing round the coke brazier. Many of the children reached school having been stumbled over rutted ground and frozen field, still wearing ordinary shoes worn by much use, usually from being passed on from older brother and sisters, and sometimes the soles would be so thin that studs and blakies wouldn't hold in the leather. Often cardboard was used as an inner sock. Fortunately, the Collins children lived opposite the school and didn't suffer these setbacks. This was about the only positive aspect of having the school so near. Elsie's reading at home was done mostly in bed by the light of a candle, and during the evening, before going upstairs, time would be filled in by knitting in front of the fire, resting her feet up on the logs set before the fire. Her sisters would embroider, make spills, rolling up strips of newspaper, make dolls' clothes and Christmas presents, kettle or iron holders, gloves, pin cushions, handkerchief sachets, lavender bags, padded coat hangers, peg bags and tea cloths. Many of these would be crocheted or contain crocheted borders. French knitting, usually using a cotton reel with looped wool over pins, made a long cord that could be tacked together in the round to make mats. A useful present could be made from sewing mothballs in red silk, providing leaves cut out of thick felt to represent holly. A hanging loop of plaited wool would ward off months in the wardrobe. Dishcloths were knitted from heavy cotton yarn, face flannels from old cut-down towels, old dresses made aprons, rag rugs, patchwork quilts, and sacking doormats. Cardboard cutouts were decorated with ink-coloured paper stuck on with flower paste to make theatre sets, were some of the pastimes which contributed towards passing long winter evenings. Her brothers designed pokerwork using red-hot skewers spliced into wooden handles, cut jigsaws out of thin pictures, pasted boards on interlaced wooden spills to make mats. Along with the harvest revels, Christmas Day and Boxing Day were the other two great occasions for the whole family. Both these were holidays celebrated by everyone, although the animals still had to be looked after. Holly and mistletoe, the only decorations, were draped across the tops of pictures and laid across the ceiling beams. Carols were sung, and everyone singing one verse on their own. Party games enjoyed, and simple presents unwrapped. The children went to church 3 times on Sunday, Christmas Day, and on each occasion they enjoyed a special meal, the highlight of the day's events, all served with parsnip wine for the elders. The church choir did the rounds, and the children knocked on doors after singing a carol. Neither New Year's Eve or the next day were marked by celebration. It was back to work with a vengeance. Every year 1 or 2 of the village school children left to go into higher education. Some of the girls took up nursing or teaching, the only 2 positions which required training for girls. Those who were to become pupil teachers could stay on at school to teach the youngest children and pick up some of the skills necessary for teaching. Trainee nurses might be taken on in hospitals if they were near enough. Both positions were underpaid, receiving less than the lowest paid worker. Women teachers and nurses in training couldn't get married, having to leave if they did so. The track to become a teacher would be as a class monitor to an uncertified teacher who was teaching the first induction class of about 50. If the monitor showed they were capable, they would be offered the formal indenture as a pupil teacher. The first hour of every day for the probationary teacher was put aside for instruction, and you could be also expected to take an annual examination for each of the 5-year apprenticeship course. Then to process to a teacher training college to take a 2-year course. After 1903, the starting age for apprenticeships was 16, paid £2 per annum. Their title was pupil teacher in a 4-year course. It's clear that a national scheme was still a long way off. The observance of one scheme rather than another depended on the local authority, whether it was at a board school or attached to a religious body. There weren't any unions or tribunals. Working arrangements were strictly adhered to. Pupil teachers had to attend county classes twice a week. This continued until the Second World War had been underway for a couple of years. Then the emergency of all-out war made such rules irrelevant. The training for both skills took until the pupil was 18, then earning about £1.16 per month. £1 usually went back home to mother, and the rest on lodgings and keep, leaving very little left when a college course was undertaken for full training. The county council paid any travelling expenses, and this was the only grant. Books had to be bought, and college fees had to be paid by the parents. An oath had to be taken by the pupil teachers that they wouldn't work out of the county for 2 years after qualifying. It also meant that the now trained teacher couldn't get married until after that period had been completed. Some children were bright enough to sit for a scholarship examination when 11 and then go to a grammar school. However, there were so few places that extra cramming had to be contemplated. School uniforms, books, sports equipment and the satchel all had to be bought, and the fares paid for train or bus. It was quite impossible for workers' children to think of such treatment. If the child was to go into trade, he had to think of an apprenticeship. There were no such schemes for girls until the late 70s. An employer had to be found to take on a lad, and there were many who wanted the chance. Most trades took 5 years to become fully trained, others 7. The parents had to pay the employer a fee for the privilege, which might be several £100s. This often meant that the boy had to leave the village and find lodgings, and at the end of his apprenticeship he would have his papers stating that he was fully qualified. He was then likely to be taken on as an improver at the lowest paid rate for at least the first 3 months, by which time the employer would be in a better place to judge whether to take on the worker. If taken on, he would take several years to be accepted as a fully trained worker, and only then would he receive the going rate for the job. An alternative was to work on a farm as a lad, to pick up the skills of a land worker and perhaps look after the animals, helping repair walls, ditches and fences. Alternately, as a carrier boy, delivering. Others employed could be found working for the local estate, park, garden or in-house. Girls usually stayed at home, under the watchful eye of mother, perhaps making lace, straw dollies or making garments. This is interesting is that the women were more adventurous than men, and that of those women it was the younger ones who opted for urban life, more often than not, to life in service. It's clear from the census figures that economic and social development since the latter part of the 19th century have confirmed that women were attracted to town life. If it only needed the stimulus of a shortage of men in the workplace to attract women from the home. Each of the two world wars had contributed to this trend of employing women. By the time the First World War was over, women had seen a complete change in social cohesion, and this was the start to the breaking up of class structures. The numbers of men killed and maimed, particularly the officer class, were felt by the gentry, who were looking forward to getting back to pre-war standards. Inheritance tax completed the breakdown. Girls from agricultural labourers' families in their first job often only worked for their keep, so they might receive training and eventually that much sought-after reference. The turnover of servants was high. The average time in a first job was 3 years. Positions for more skilled trades was found through the grapevine, the church, tradesmen, family or friends. Elsie started work 4 years after the Great War had finished, in 1922. Immediately on leaving school at the age of 14, her father, aged 52, was employed as an independent lace engineer at Small and Tidmus net factory, doing maintenance work. Her mother was looking after 10 of her children at home. It's uncertain if they were all living together, but certainly 7 were, which made Roseley Cottage very cramped living indeed. The eldest child, Dora, was 22, who worked as a lace mender, one of a group of women who checked the lace for breakages and snags, repairing holes by drawing threads together. 4 years later she married Sidney Wood and left home to live in Chard. The youngest child, Vera, was now age 4. The number of children conceived close together was normal for the working class, and the lack of living space common for the poor. The obvious lack of family planning being the result of the absence of sex education, lack of discipline and personal ambition. There was also a degree of conforming to general behaviour patterns. And even though there was a national exodus to the cities and towns, there were still sufficient jobs and insufficient jobs and housing. In the late 1920s, neither the Tatworth Parish Housing Scheme at Welling Close provided sufficient housing, nor did the Perry Street factory cottages, mainly taken up by retired workers. This shortage mainly affected the growing population of young people with children. Money was short, jobs hard to come by, and even when they did, the choice was limited. Everything had to be within cycle range. It's not generally realised that between the end of the First World War and 1922, 1/4 of the land in Britain changed hands. It was not appreciated at the time and had scarcely been written about since. It was not just one factor that brought this about. The great landowners were short of cash, and they were tired of the responsibility after so many of the owners and their male progeny had been killed in the slaughter at the front. It could have been put down to taxation, poor grain harvests, imported grain prices forcing down the profitability, and the decline in the old tenant-landlord system. However, it came to a head. The old ways couldn't continue. The aristocracy had let them down, and now it was the turn of the trade unions and the Labour Party. Surely the workers could rely upon each other.